Okay, so now I want to begin our extensive discussion of the next unit, which involves substitution and elimination of various compounds, mostly alkyl halides. And we'll start this discussion by talking about SN2. SN2, S means substitution, 2 means bimolecular. Bimolecular nucleophilic substitution. And we'll begin just by thinking about the mechanism. So you'll have some carbon-containing compound with what now I'll denote as just generic leaving group. We'll explore multiple leaving groups later on and their relative rates. And we'll treat this with a generic nucleophile. And the mechanism is simple. It is concerted. It may not be simple for the transition state to form, we'll talk about that later, but it is quite simple in terms of arrow pushing. So the nucleophile simply attacks the carbon that has a leaving group and displaces that. Or you form 1 sigma bond and break 1 sigma bond. The leaving group is simply now in the solution. So the mechanism involves 2 things, which means the rate is going to be proportional to the concentration of 2 things. There's always a rate constant that tells us something about the mechanism and transition state stability.